and then moved to BBC Radio, and I've spent the last sort of 12, 13 years at the BBC across various different departments, starting at radio and then moving on to TV, doing some field reporting out in India, as well as online, social media, digital. Up until recently, I spent about 5-6 years managing the UGC and social media team in the main BBC newsroom. And over the last year, I've been working on a project looking particularly at instant messaging platforms. So at the start of the year, I had a sort of a 3-month brief to try and look at what the potential sort of editorial propositions could be around chat platforms such as WhatsApp or BBM, WeChat and Line and so on. And that led to a number of editorial experiments that we did. The most prominent one was probably during the Indian general elections, where we set up a BBC News account inside WhatsApp and also on WeChat, and it was a dual language account on both those platforms, in English and in Hindi, and learned some very interesting lessons using both of those platforms. And most recently we've run a special public health information service for people in West Africa to convey information about the spread of Ebola. And that's also been something that was the first time we've used sort of a chat platform in this sort of way of conveying public health information. And I've now sort of taken on that initial project as in a full-time capacity, so I moved over as in the role of apps editor at BBC World Service and Global News. And so in addition to instant messaging platforms, I'm also now tasked with looking at our own in-house news apps, particularly for our language services. So BBC News has 28 different language services globally. And so over the next year or so, we'll be looking at our current news apps and upgrading those and developing work on that. So I guess that's just sort of a quick overview on what I'm doing. I don't know if you want me to talk about anything specifically, or if you've got any questions generally.
No, go ahead, please.
Okay, so what would you like me to talk about more specifically? A particular, do you want me to talk maybe a bit more about the Indian election and what we did there?
Yeah.
Okay, so we were very aware leading up to the Indian election that this would be a truly sort of social and digital-led election campaign, particularly amongst the younger generation in India, where you had upwards of 100 million first-time voters that were going to be going to the polls, and a lot of them were going to be active on social media. And we'd already got, you know, quite a good sort of presence on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and so on. But one thing I personally was very interested in is what was happening on platforms like WhatsApp, which had grown exponentially over the past year to 18 months. Just to give you a sense of the sort of the growth trajectory of WhatsApp, I think in all of 2013, Twitter added about 15 million users globally. In the last quarter of last year, so the last 3 months of last year alone, WhatsApp added 100 million users globally. And we know now that in India alone, WhatsApp has about 70 million active users, and India is the single biggest country of WhatsApp users. And so we were trying to think about how do we get ourselves into this space where we can begin to try and engage WhatsApp users around our editorial content. It's different to other social media platforms, which are generally open. So if you tweet something, you know, anyone in the world can see it. To an extent, Facebook is, you know, open to where anyone who's connected to you can see what you're posting. But with WhatsApp, it was a very different thing, where you couldn't just connect and see everyone involved. So that was part of the challenge. I've just noticed Jane's connected. Do you want to have a quick hello to her?
Yeah. Hey, sorry.
Yeah, hello Jane. And, yeah, whilst waiting for you, we just requested Trushar to take off. So he's explaining his bit.
So yeah, I was just talking about what the BBC News was doing on WhatsApp and WeChat, particularly around the Indian general election. And so we had some conversations with WhatsApp to say, you know, ask them, have they ever come across a news organization using WhatsApp as a way of distributing news content inside the platform? And they hadn't. They were as interested as we were to find out if there was actually a proposition that could be developed which would be of use to WhatsApp users. And so what we ended up doing was we created an account in the same way that you would create an account inside WhatsApp, just acquired a mobile phone and a SIM, and then we just started promoting that number across our existing distribution channels. So we promoted that number through social media, we promoted it through our website, and asked people to sort of send subscribe messages, and so that we could then add their numbers onto a WhatsApp broadcast list. And we experimented with different types of content, and I've blogged a little bit about this, so I'm happy to send you links and slides afterwards if you guys want to look at it in a bit more detail. But we tried a range of different content that we posted out, from sort of short audio and video clips, images from our various reporters and producers from the field, infographics that we were producing, as well as sort of text updates. We sort of limited ourselves to about 2 or 3 items a day because we were aware that we didn't want to spam users by posting too frequently. And the only time that changed was on election results day itself, where we sort of promoted up to a week in advance that we were going to turn the volume up on our posts on election results day, so that we turned it into effectively a live rolling results and analysis service. And actually, as we started promoting that, we noticed a big spike in user subscriptions, and we probably doubled the number of users we had leading up to election results day. And we ended up posting probably about 25 items on that day, which included just sort of snapshots of the latest election poll results as they were coming through, sort of reports from the field from our correspondents, and instant analysis from our main bureau team in Delhi. And it proved to be very successful, and I think one of the main reasons for that was that many people were very, very keen to find out what was happening in the election. And you know, I've covered Indian election results in the past, and I've never known an election result that had such interest amongst the general public, to the extent that, you know, my own mother woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning and was glued to the Indian news channels throughout the day. A lot of Indians, I think, like the fact that they were able to get updates from our WhatsApp service, because quite often they'll be at work. Most of those workplaces didn't have news channels that were easily available to watch whilst you're in the workplace. Most Indians also didn't tend to have very big data plans in terms of their internet connection, so they couldn't keep checking on websites on their phone because it would be quite expensive potentially. But then getting a free sort of WhatsApp alert became a very good way for them to just keep on top of the story, and that seemed to work really, really well for them. We did a slightly different strategy with WeChat, which was based much more on pushing out one daily sort of news bulletin alert, which was, and the bulletin took the form of sort of 4 or 5 headlines and images, and people could tap on each of those segments and then be taken to the relevant story. And in addition to that, if they went to our own sort of home account inside WeChat, they would also be able to get the latest news feeds that we were providing on the election as well. And both of that was in Hindi and English. And in terms of what we've mainly learned from that experiment, it was much easier to use WeChat because WeChat has a sort of a content management system that's built in. So as a brand or a news brand, it was relatively straightforward for us to be able to manage user subscriptions, post content, and monitor feedback and get some basic analytics. WhatsApp currently doesn't have any of that functionality, and so it requires a much higher level of sort of labor intensity in terms of managing that account. And so I spent quite a few hours each day just going on my phone handset, you know, add contact, save contact, move to broadcast list. And I did that thousands of times during a 6-week period, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But it was something that was the only way of basically making it work for us, for our purposes. So we were effectively sort of hacking ourselves around the limitations of the app to make it work for what we wanted it to do. And since then, we've done a number of other experiments on different chat platforms, including BBM for our Nigerian service, BBC Hausa. We've also experimented with another app called Mixit in South Africa during their elections. And more recently, we've launched a global English account on the Line app, which is particularly big in parts of East Asia and growing in South Asia. And actually my colleagues in our Delhi bureau launched a BBC Hindi account inside Line just under a month ago as well, and that's already had over 100,000 subscribers, and so is doing pretty well. So that's a sort of an overview of what we've been up to.
Yeah, thanks, Trushar. Jane, can you just take on from here, please?
Sorry, say.
Yeah, over to you, Jane.
Okay, thanks. The audio is not very good. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, fine.
You can hear okay? So I'm going to put on the slides. So being an academic, I have some slides. So what I want to talk about a little bit is more broadly disruption over the past 20 years and kind of how that's affected journalists and how journalists have responded. I'm kind of going to focus more on print media because that's what I know better, and mostly on the quality press. And I apologize, it's mostly about the U.S. and the U.K., actually mostly about the U.S., but also about the U.K. So I apologize for that, and I hope we can talk about what's actually going on in India, because I don't know a lot about it, and I would love to know more about it. So let me kind of go through this, and Deb, you'll interrupt me when I'm running out of time, because it might run a little bit long otherwise. So, but let me try and do screen share. I have not used Google Plus before, so bear with me here. All right. So can you guys see the slides there?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of trot through these. So if I do the, hang on one second here. Let me see if I can do the slideshow because it'll go one by one. Does that work still?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so real quickly, because you know what these all are. So over the past 20 years, journalists have gone through these kind of successive waves of change. So really your entire lifetimes, for some of you, have been one of change in the profession that you're going into, as you know. And I'm not going to spend much time on these because you know what they all are. Obviously, the tools have changed dramatically. You know, the internet just kind of became something that people used really only in your lifetime. So within the past, some of your lifetimes, some of you may be a little bit older, but within the past 20 years or so. The nature of the tasks, of course, that go with those tools are also vastly different. Every single tool that's come along, we've had to know how to do some different things with it. Maybe more interesting one, and one that's taken a little more time to develop, and I think it's been more challenging to journalists, because we're always learning new tools and learning how to do, you know, from WhatsApp and how we can cover elections better with that, you know, all the way back to how we might find information online when we first got onto the internet. But what I think is sort of a different, it's been more challenging for journalists because it's something that really is a cultural thing as opposed to just using the technologies kinds of things. Although that has been challenging as well. Has been this idea that we are part of a community, if you like, or part of a back and forth with people who we never really had a back and forth with before, which may be hard to think about. But when I was in a newspaper and then online journalist even many years ago, we didn't really think about audience. We didn't have much relationship with them. We had relationships with our editors and our colleagues in the newsroom, and we had relationships with sources. And this idea that we had any kind of meaningful exchange with the public is a new idea. So that's been disruptive for journalists. Obviously, competition is exploded again. Back before the internet, really competition was the other newspapers in town, if there were any, and if there were other broadcasters, then that would include them, and that was about it. You could sort of define who the competition was. The competition was much like you, except working for a different organization, perhaps. Obviously, that's no longer true. And why that's been disruptive is it's raised all kinds of questions about who really is a journalist and what is it that constitutes journalism. It's obviously it's no longer only what I do inside the newsroom, but then in that case, what is it? So that's been very disruptive. And then also, and this isn't really particularly new, but it's become much more so as competition has expanded and also as the nature of the business has changed as well, and you know, economically been kind of devastated, as I'll say a little bit more about on the next slide. That the nature of the work that journalists do is increasingly precarious, increasingly contracted out, as opposed to being working for an employer. So that's some of the journalism practices disruption. I'm actually going to talk most about that, and I'll probably stop after I get through that so that we can have more of a conversation, but I do have some information about business practices as well. Let me just quickly, a couple of slides about business practice, just to have that as something we can talk about if we want to come back to it later. Obviously, massive changes there too, again, in the age of the internet in the past 20 years. So, and we know all these things as well. So audiences have declined, and revenue has declined, and audiences, as they've it's not just that the numbers have gone down, although they have gone down, it's that, of course, the audiences have fragmented in various ways. I think two are especially important. Obviously, they've gone to competitors. Many of those competitors didn't exist before. But also, and maybe more, in some ways more fundamental, their audiences are less interested in a package of information. It's not just going and picking up the newspaper or turning on the 10 o'clock news and getting the package that a journalist has put together for you. Obviously, we don't do that anymore. And so how media organizations and how journalists respond to that, and how they keep audiences, and how they deal with the fact that their business model really has been decimated. The business model is, of course, based on advertising and audiences intertwined in various ways. That's been very, very disruptive. Again, competition we know about, we talked about. And I really do think that a big part of the problem is that until really recently, and it's less so at some organizations than others, the BBC has been very innovative for a long time. The Guardian has been very innovative for a long time. Other organizations have tried things and learned from them and moved on and done things for a very long time. But by and large, well, I don't want to single out any particular organization because it won't mean that much in your context anyway. But by and large, I think for a very long time, I think only until the past few years, really, only since the recession, I think media managers tended to see what was happening as something that would turn itself around, that this was a change, this was sort of a fad in some ways. It was going to be something that people would use, but it wouldn't really affect the core business that they were in, and ultimately those audiences would come back, that this change was said, my advertisers would come back and the revenue model would come back, that this change was cyclical. Well, it's not cyclical, as I think it's obvious now. It's not. It's a fundamental structural change, but we didn't see it that way for a long time. And so by the time that we figured that out, a lot of businesses were in big trouble. So that's kind of been the nature of the disruption. What I want to talk about for another 10 minutes or so, and then I'll stop and we can come back to this, but probably more interesting to have more of a conversation, is how journalists have reacted. So setting aside the business people, we can come back to them. I do have a few slides on it, which Dev can share with you if you're interested. But how journalists have reacted. I assume most of you are going into newsrooms, are going to be working as journalists. So let me kind of trace this. And some of this is historical. I know some of it's going to seem silly, but I think you can see a pattern in how journalists have reacted to change over the years. Not every journalist. There have always been creative journalists and innovative journalists and journalists who have said, wow, this is really exciting, I'm going to jump on this. to be honest, they've been in the minority at first. It takes a while for that to become the attitude that people hold, and some people, frankly, never hold it. So this has kind of been the pattern over time. And I'm going to kind of go through this and show you some examples of it. But there's kind of this sense of fear at first. Another slide about this, so I'll go to that. And then resistance is a badge of honor, and on the next slide we'll explain what I mean about that. And then we do get past that, and we say, well, wait a minute, this might actually be something that's useful. You know, I've actually been in the U.S. context. I've done a series of studies tracking how journalists covered the election in the U.S. election, the presidential election in the year 2000, and then 2004, and then 2008, and again in 2012. Sorry?
Can I interrupt for a moment, please? The slides are not moving.
Oh, okay. Sorry, they're not loading.
They're not moving.
Okay.
Yeah,
and I don't know what to do about that. How do I make them show? Sorry, I'm sorry. I'm on about slide 5. I'm sorry. I had no idea they weren't showing. I screen share.
Yeah, it's fine now. It's fine now.
Now?
Yeah,
no?
we're on the 5th slide. Yeah.
Okay, so are they showing now?
Yeah.
No. So have you not seen any of the slides?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, I won't go back. I talked through them, and that's fine. Sorry, I apologize. I'm sorry about that. Like I said, I've never used this tool before, so new to me. So I'll just leave it in this mode, and that should work. So fear, resistance, and then it might be useful, and then at some point we decide we can't live without it. Okay. Now, if I'm screen sharing, okay, how do I get to the next slide? I don't know how to do that. Okay. I think I'm going to have to come in and out each time. I don't know how else to do it. Okay.
Yeah.
Screen share? No? Yes? Well, I guess I can just talk to it, although it really, it's not going to work real well unless you can see the quotes that are coming up. Can you guys see that slide?
Yeah,
is there a slide displaying?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Now I can't see the slide, but that's okay. All right, we'll try it again. So the reaction has kind of followed this sort of pattern. To each new change as it's come along, first of all, I'm kind of afraid of this because I don't know how it works. And then that sense that I don't know how it works gets justified. People express that fear by saying, well, it's okay that I don't really understand this new thing that's coming along because it's going to be a problem. It's going to create problems for doing real journalism, the real journalism that involves reporting in particular. It's going to cause problems, and so it's okay that I don't really understand it and don't know how to do it. So let me go through, if I can, some slides. Don't really quite know how to do this. Well, this is just really kind of a pain in the butt. Is there any way that you could display the slides there and just no? Dan? It's going to be difficult if they can't actually see the quotes. It's not going to make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, I have the slides here, and I'll just circulate it among the students.
Okay. So if you could display the slides separately, then?
No, I can't play from here, but I can circulate it.
Okay. I'm sure there's a way to do this, but I just don't know the tool well enough to know what it is. Well, what would you suggest would be the best way to proceed? You want to just have a conversation rather than going through this, or what would be best?
Yeah.
Okay. What would you like to talk about then? Journalists have. I mean, the slides kind of detail how this has evolved. Ultimately, my point that I get to that's been a reaction to every change that's come along. Is there's been this sort of sense of It's something I don't understand. It's something that is going to detract from the journalism that I want to do. And then ultimately we get beyond that and actually discovered that it's quite valuable and that in fact it leads to better journalism. And if you go through the presentation, I kind of trace how that happens. I do think I eventually get to a slide and talk about social media. I think we kind of turned a corner with social media. I think social media was a dramatic change in a whole lot of different ways. Brought us closer to an audience in a way that hadn't really happened before. It was a change in just in a lot of different kinds of directions. And I think that with social media, we actually got past the trepidation and the resistance much more quickly. In part because it was obvious very soon how valuable it was as a reporting tool. So reporting tends to be the fundamental thing that journalists focus on when they think about a new thing, and it's how is this going to help me as a reporter? And if they see it as being something that in fact will take too much time or too much energy, or they don't know how to use it, or it will, they can't go out and talk to people because they're worrying about how to use the technology. I mean, all those things keep coming up over time. With social media, I think it was really clear pretty quickly that this was an amazing reporting tool, and that they could, we can reach people, we can talk to people, we can get information from people all over the world in a way we couldn't before. And so I think journalists pretty quickly with social media figured out how to make it work in the context of reporting ethics, which have to do with getting the information right and remaining independent and kind of some fundamental ethical things. They figured out how to do that a lot more quickly than they did with some of the other things that had come along, and that has made social media more quickly valuable to journalists and more widely used by journalists in a whole variety of ways, as Trushar was talking about when I joined in. That's quite interesting. So I do think that while I'm sure there will continue to be that pattern of trepidation, fear, resistance as new things come along, I do think social media has shown us a way to get past that pretty quickly. And I guess I'll stop there. We could just talk about whatever it is that you'd like to talk about.
Trushar, Jane, can we just throw the floor open for questions, please?
Sure.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that. Sorry, my sound is just terrible.
No, it's all right, Jane. The students they have some questions for you, both of you. So they're going to come here and ask you questions.
Okay, great.
Hi Trushar, hi Jane. My question is for Trushar about the elections that we covered. I just wanted to know how do you go about selecting the stories? Would you go local or would you go for the stories that are of national importance? And if you choose local stories, what problems did you face while putting them across? Did you get various kinds of reactions? And while you were passing across national stories, when you said that you chose 3 or 4 stories for the day, what kind of reaction did it have?
Sure. So when we were thinking about what sort of content would work, particularly for our WhatsApp subscribers, we were thinking about a couple of things. One was what's the likely sort of user base that we're reaching out to and that we're going to be talking to? And secondly, what is it that we can offer as BBC News that's going to be uniquely relevant and useful for WhatsApp users in India? we sort of originally assumed that it was going to be sort of a younger generation that would be mostly be connecting with us, and that was certainly true, but it was also quite surprising that the demographic was actually pretty wide as well. So older people were also sort of connecting with us, and English speakers or Hindi only speakers as well. And in terms of what we felt would be most useful in terms of what we could offer, one thing we were very aware of was that partly just explaining the election process and explaining the issues involved and explaining a bit more about who these parties were, who the leaders were, what are the issues that they were campaigning on, but also giving some sort of international context in terms of how the rest of the world sees the Indian election. Because as a global news organization, we felt that that was something that we could uniquely offer to subscribers. And actually, I know some of the content that we got the most positive feedback from was we had a number of our reporters in different bureaux from Moscow to the US to Paris to Germany to and Africa and other parts of Asia like Japan and so on, where they would just go out on the streets and ask ordinary people in those countries what their perception of India is. And we fed that back just or what relationship they would like their countries to have with India in terms of diplomatic relations or trade or foreign policy or whatever. And that sort of content did particularly well because I think a lot of Indians are just very interested in seeing understanding how the world views India. The other thing we were very aware of was that we were picking up quite a lot of cynicism amongst Indian voters to your domestic media organizations. The issue of paid media in India is a really big one. And even on social media, I came across so many examples of Indian journalists from the mainstream or news organizations that were constantly being bombarded by Indian voters with suggestions that they're not being straight with the public, or they were peddling a particular line for their corporate masters and so on. And one of the things that I think BBC News still has in India is this reputation of independence, of impartial journalism, of authoritative reporting. And that was something that we felt helped us to really identify ourselves as, offering something unique for Indian voters. And so quite often it was our own correspondents giving sort of analysis of how they saw the election going, what they thought of the main protagonists at Congress and BJP, Kejriwal, and some of the other regional parties as well. And hopefully conveying content in a way which wasn't just sort of standard BBC News content, but was a little bit more personal. And allowing people the opportunity to have a bit more engagement inside the platform. And so one of the things that I think worked particularly well, and it's quite a low level of interactivity, but I felt was really effective, was using emoji or emoticons inside WhatsApp. And so just, when we post a story, just seeing the range of sort of smiley faces, sad faces, angry faces that were being posted back to us by our WhatsApp users, that gave us a sort of a sense of what they felt about a story, which was quite an unusual sort of thing for us, because most of our audience interaction is more based around whether someone likes what we posted or shares something that we posted, or sometimes they might leave a comment at the bottom of an online story. But getting almost like an instant sense of how people feel about a story was something that was quite interesting and quite new for us. And so we'd often, take note of that sort of interaction and invite more of it. And I think ideally one of the things that we're looking at, as part of the learnings from this experiment is how we can engage audiences much more in an interactive way using the sort of inherent facilities and features within platforms like WhatsApp. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, you have, and I have a little question as to what you answered. What kind of stories induced more interaction with the audience? As you said, you use different kind of content, images, and text, and different kinds of content. So what was the specific type which induced a lot of reaction?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. I mean, one of the things that we found particularly engaging with our audience was almost sort of taking them behind the scenes and explaining the electoral process. So one of our correspondents in Delhi, Shilpa Kannan, went to the Indian Electoral Commission and actually saw these sort of voting machines and just explained how the voting machines work, what the process is in terms of how they actually collect votes, and then once the election is out the way, how do these votes get recorded and counted, and just sort of revealing that process. A lot of people found really, really useful and valuable. Another thing I think which people really liked was on this issue of paid content. We actually did a radio documentary just looking at this issue, which was an hour and a half long documentary, which is broadcast in the UK. But we took clips from that documentary and just posted it out as almost like a sort of a mini instant messaging service series. And so over the course of a week, every day we posted a short clip from that documentary from different people involved in the media industry in India and political figures and analysts talking about what they thought of this issue of paid media and where they felt this was a real issue. And we got a lot of very positive feedback from that, where we basically took a sort of a different sort of medium in terms of a long-form documentary, but sliced it into very short clips of about 35 to 45 seconds or so, and just pushing that out onto WhatsApp. And that worked really well. And I guess one final thing that was worked very well, which was a sort of a daily feature that we did, which was we would push out the morning's top news headlines just in text format with links to the story if people wanted to click on them to find out more about the details of that story. And so we sent it out in text, and also we would clip the BBC Hindi radio news broadcast bulletin as well, and just clip a 1-minute headline summary in Hindi, which we'd push out in the morning, again, some point between 7 and 9 in the morning, so that users could just get this as a pop-up on their phone as soon as they woke up or were getting ready for work, and just get up to date with all the news that morning. And that seemed to be a very effective service as well.
Thank you, Trushar.
Hi Tushar, hi Jane, this is Ankita. I have a question for you. It's a very generic question. Like you're talking about use of social media to disseminate information, BBC and all other big new television companies or media houses have their own phone apps. And if I'm not wrong, these WhatsApp and all these apps can be only used on a smartphone. So if somebody has a smartphone, they would have a BBC. If they want to, they want to be informed, they would have apps like BBC or NDTV or CNN and IBN apps on their phone. So what kind of a difference does disseminating information on on a social media platform make, whereas you can do the same thing on a BBC, you would do the same thing on a BBC app which is on the phone. So what kind of a difference is it there when you do giving out the information through WhatsApp? Like you said, during the elections, you used WhatsApp and other social media. It could have been done through the same process could have been done through BBC app, which is on the phone. And it is interactive, if I'm not wrong, because people can leave comments on BBC app. Also, if you read a story, you can leave a comment. So what kind of a difference does it make?
Well, maybe I can talk a bit about the BBC, and then Jane might want to pick up on the wider points to that question. In terms of the BBC, I think it just comes down to how we can reach different audiences. So we already know that we have a quite a good sort of loyal, dedicated audience of BBC listeners, viewers, or users of our website or our mobile phone apps. So what we're then doing with WhatsApp or WeChat or these other off-site platforms is really to see if we can reach audiences that aren't already connected to us. So it's not so much that we're trying to replicate what we're doing for the sake of replicating it, but the strategy is very much about trying to see if we can engage people who don't normally interact with us. And so part of the idea with the WhatsApp and WeChat accounts during the Indian election, for example, was that we wanted to see if there was a way of extending our sort of reach or our sort of digital footprint amongst Indian voters. And as we knew, anecdotally, there were tens of millions of WhatsApp users in India. Almost certainly none of them, or very few of them, probably consume BBC News on a regular basis. So here for us was an opportunity for us to reach a new pool of people that we could then sort of spread the BBC News brand, get them to experience or consume some of our content in bite-sized portions, and then if they like it, then they might go on to the full meal and listen to our radio bulletins, or go to the website and discover more of us from our news channels, for example. So that was sort of the strategy in terms of what we're doing with these sort of third-party platforms and why we were doing it, compared to just not sticking with our own news apps.
Okay, thank you so much. Would you have to say about this, Jane?
Well, I think that's a really smart strategy. And I think media organizations are figuring out creative ways to reach different audiences, and also to give, in some ways, I think, to give the same audience different kinds of options for engaging with the information. And I think that was a point that Trushar was making as well, that there's lots of different ways that you can get to what it is that you're looking for, and it's fun and engaging and interesting and useful to be able to take each of those platforms and do what it does well. I just recently looked at some examples of some really nice content that was up for British Journalism Awards in digital innovation, and one that stuck out in my mind was The Guardian, which kind of owns the NSA Snowden security story, and the way that they told that story was basically web-based, but the way that they told that story was by giving the audience, as they went through the story, again, this is just on one platform, but even so, lots and lots of different ways that they could consume information. So they could listen to interviews, or they could explore some data, or they could, take sort of an interactive thing and think of and see, what does the NSA or the British equivalent know about me. There were lots of different things that allowed people to get something out of that story in a lot of different ways, and I think the good news organizations, obviously like the BBC, are doing that really well. So I think that expansion into different platforms kind of opens up these abilities to do storytelling in ways that will be effective. And one of the reasons I highlighted social media is I think that it, in particular, has turned journalists, in a beneficial way, turned journalists' attention toward the audience, toward what it will work for other people. Whereas before we kind of engaged with these interactive formats, it was really more about what worked for me and my editors inside the newsroom. And so I think what we're describing here is a space where it's really about helping the audience to get something meaningful out of that story in whatever way it is that they might want to do that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, Jane. Hi, Trushar. This is Vijay. My question is to Jane. I wanted to, when you push the factor of innovation to, like, Jane, you are from America and you are now working in London. So I wanted to ask, like, when you push the concept of innovation to journalists or people who are working in media organization, is the reaction different compared to Americans and UK? And even the audience, how do they, like, is the audience, the way they interact, the kind of things they consume, is it different in UK and US?
Yeah, actually a lot of people here seem to think that the people in the US are more creative and innovative than they are here. I don't think that's true, actually. I think it very much is influenced by the media structure. So in the UK, there is in some ways more diversity of structure. So because you have the BBC, which of course is a trust. You have a newspaper like you have The Guardian. It's not, there aren't newspapers like The Guardian, but you have The Guardian that's also owned by a trust, but is a commercial enterprise, and you have a lot of commercial enterprises, some of which are kind of independent, some of which are corporate owned. You have a very strong national press. So it's a very different media structure in the UK than in the US. I do think one thing that's different in the UK, I think, is it's very concentrated in London. Sorry, my lights go off. I have various issues with my technologies of all different kinds. That in the UK, it's very, very concentrated in London, and so there's an enormous amount of innovation taking place here. My university where I work is not far from a area of town called Tech City. There's just a lot going on there all the time. Very, very vibrant and innovative community. I'm not sure how widely that's true across the country. I think it seems to me, Trushar will know better than I do, but it seems to be very concentrated in London. In the U.S., it is more diffused. It's a much bigger country, and there are more centers of innovation in different places. So there's Silicon Valley, and there's New York, and there's the political scene in Washington, and then there's other things going on in other places in between. And so you get more different approaches and different perspectives, I think, to some extent because of that geographic difference and also because of this media structural difference. But I think the environments for innovation are supportive in both countries, and I do think that there's amazing things going on in both places, and I'm sure in many other countries, obviously including India, there's a lot of cool things that I read about. I don't know a lot about them going on in India as well. So while British people seem to say that they feel like they're behind, I really don't think they are, to be honest.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yeah. I don't know, Trushar. I don't know what your experience is. Coming as an outsider, it does seem very concentrated in London to me. I don't know if you feel like.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that's very unique to the UK, that pretty much everything is concentrated in London, whether it's business, politics, tech, media. Media to an extent is a little bit more diversified in terms of there are sort of hubs in sort of Cardiff and Manchester and Glasgow, but yeah, in terms of technology, I think London is pretty much where it's at. I guess the only slight exception is in terms of the gaming industry, where a lot of that is actually interestingly concentrated in Scotland.
Interesting. Yeah. No, it's good. It's a good question.
Hello, Jane. Hello, Trushar. My question is about a digital media initiative which was launched by BBC in February 2008. This was done to develop new technology for BBC staff to create, share and manage video and audio content and programs from their desktops. But the project was cancelled and taken back in May 2013. So my question is, can you tell us what disruption in terms of technology or innovation led to the failure of the program?
I don't know the details enough about it to give you a sort of a detailed sort of history of what failed with that program. Obviously, it was a big failure and a very high-profile failure, and the new director general. Just put his hands up and said, we got it wrong on this instance. I think wider in terms of the industry, archiving digital content has been a massive problem. And there've been loads of different sort of methods that have been thought about in terms of how do you successfully preserve and digitize content that may be in lots of different formats with very old technology, in a way that is still easily accessible, is easily storable, and is relatively effective. Now, from sort of my outside looking in terms of the DMI project, I think it's just a very good example of just how quickly technology changes and moves forward. Whereas, when the DMI initiative was first conceived, I would imagine it was thought of as being the best sort of solution in town at the time, and it's very difficult, I would imagine, to really be able to foresee where technology is going, 5 years in advance. At the moment, BBC News is involved in a very interesting internal project called the Future of News, which I'm sure at some point, your class might want to find out more about with the people who are involved in that at some point. But one of the things as part of that project is trying to think about not just the next year or 2 or 3 years, but what could media industry be like in the next 15, 20 years? Obviously, no one has the answer to that. But it's trying to make sort of a big bet on where do we think all of this technology is moving to, or what possibilities may open up that don't currently exist. And And so I think in terms of the DMI initiative, technology just moved on is a short answer to your question, and other solutions came along that didn't exist when DMI was first introduced, and these other solutions were just much cheaper and better to use. I think the BBC just took a strategic view of whether we want to continue pouring money down a black hole with the current DMI, with that DMI initiative, or just make a call and say, listen, let's just cut our losses and just actually invest in other technology which has now emerged.
Okay. Thank you.
Jane, I don't know if you've got any other thoughts in terms of
Well,
how
I was going to ask,
this.
Can you tell us anything about what the future is going to be, and where that project is?
Well, I think there is, this is probably a different session all on its own, just in terms of, looking at where, disruption is going in the future in terms of, I was at the Online News Association conference in Chicago last month, and there are just so many very interesting sessions and demos about new technology that's emerging. On one hand, you've got sort of the virtual worlds that are now almost becoming a reality with technology like Oculus Rift. Then you've got massive disruption that's on the horizon in terms of wearable technology, and then again massive disruption in terms of sort of, I can't remember the exact term, but it's sort of effectively intuitive technology, where technology knows what you want before you do, and how that's going to have an impact on how you consume news or how news comes to you. So there's so many different areas where all of this stuff is probably going to completely revolutionize how we interact with people.
And it's always hard to know. I mean, it's easy to look back from the present and look back at the past and say, well, how did we not see that coming? But you don't see it. I mean, there's always 100 different things going on, and very difficult to figure out which is the one that's really going to take you forward. It's very, very difficult. It's easy to. Yeah. I think about this particularly in terms of media organizations, because we look back and we think, well, how did they possibly think? The BBC, again, is different because of its structure, but how did they possibly think that giving information away for free forever was going to be the way forward? But of course they did, because they thought it was simply an advertising model, and that the advertising model is that the more people that you have, the more you can charge for your advertising. And it's kind of unfair from where we are now to look back and say, well, obviously that wasn't going to work. Well, wasn't it all obvious that wasn't going to work at the time? It's very hard to know what's going to be the place to put your bets, the right pony to put your money on.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Hi Jane, hi Trushar. This is Aisha. I have a question for you, Jane. There was a report by Poynter Institute which said that regarding innovations in journalism, the educators and who are higher up in the organization are generally more open to innovation and feel that it is very basic and needed criteria in today's journalism, while the students of journalism or like ground reporters felt that it was not that much an important tool. While when we see the consumers, we see that who are like young and new to technology, they are more open to take up multimedia and convergent storytelling. So what is your take on this like apparent disparity between media houses and media consumers?
I'm sorry, it's hard to hear you. Sorry, are you asking about what direction journalism education should take?
Sorry,
no. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I just couldn't get the question.
Yeah, I'll just repeat the question once more. And there was a report by Poynter Institute which said that educators and people who are higher up in the organization think that multimedia storytelling is more like crucial to journalism rather than the ground reporters. Okay, but when we see the media consumers, we see that young, like who are generally supposed to be more tech savvy, they're more open to multimedia and convergent storytelling rather than, let's say, the older generation. So what is your take on this apparent like disparity between media houses and media consumers?
Media organizations and media consumers. I'm actually, young people are savvy about the technologies that they use, but what I've sort of seen over the years is that openness to innovation is not really an age thing, much less than you would think it would be. You're comfortable with what you use because that's what you use, and that's how you get information. That's what your friends do, and you get it. But when it comes to being kind of having an open mind to the next thing that you don't know. Because I think, you know, when you're sitting in a classroom and we look back at what the media, how journalists have reacted to new things, you think, well, that's just stupid. But you know what? In 2 years, there's going to be a new thing that you don't know, and you know, the kids who are coming up behind you in school are going to know it, and you're going to be in that exact same situation. And how we react to that is really, I think, much more to do with kind of our personality and our openness and our curiosity and a lot of different things that aren't so much about age. Media organizations, though, I mean, there is a media organizations need to make money. You know, particularly, I mean, even ones that are owned by trust and have public funding. I mean, somehow they have to have money to sustain what they do, and so that is inherently going to make them, I think, somewhat conservative. And I think that's why we see so many competitors coming up and being able to just do something innovative, some of which catches on and a lot of which doesn't, but some of which does. Because typically they have an investor who says something like, you know, here's £500,000, whatever it might be, go out and be creative, and they get to try and they get to fail. It's very difficult for media organizations to fail because, particularly ones that are publicly owned, that have stockholders, it's just difficult to go to your board and to your shareholders and say, well, we just lost, you know, half of our value because this thing that we thought was going to work failed. And so I think organizations tend to be conservative. Audiences have no real investment in being conservative. I mean, the technology itself is pretty cheap to buy and try, and so audiences are always going to be more into the new thing than media organizations can really afford to be. I mean, it's kind of sad. I think, again, smart organizations like the BBC and like some others have created spaces where they can look at the future and they can try some things, and they can kind of carve out places where they can try and fail. But that's not always possible to do, and it is costly. And you know, at some point you have to figure out which basket you're going to put your eggs in, and that can be hard to do. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think there's an inherently conservative tendency in a commercial news organization that isn't reflected in audiences because they don't have the stake in being conservative when it comes to trying something new. Does that answer your question? Is that what you're getting at, or not so much?
Thanks for the observations, Jane. Trushar, do you have individual observations on this?
Yeah, just very much agree with Jane's point about sort of the conservative with a small c sort of organizational viewpoint with a lot of this sort of technology. The other thing I would add is that traditionally most news organizations and sort of more of the sort of institutional news organizations have viewed sort of new technology with very sort of blinkered perspectives. So, you know, when a new technology comes along, it's very much, okay, how can we get what we currently do just onto that space? And they rarely really look at how that technology is actually being used by the wider public. And increasingly, I think we're all realizing that the world doesn't revolve around us, or our audience's interest doesn't revolve around what we do. And we're maybe increasingly a small bit part of their lives in terms of how they, you know, get access to information. So even the example of, you know, what we're doing on chat apps. One of the things I've discovered very quickly with, for example, WhatsApp in India, were that Indians are far more innovative in terms of how WhatsApp is being used in the country than I had thought about, where I was originally just thinking in a very blinkered way about how we can use news within WhatsApp. But I came across an example. A colleague of mine in the Delhi bureau was telling me about his uncle, who is quite a poor farmer in a rural part of India, who had to move to Mumbai to earn a bit more of a living. And so every week he now gets his wife to WhatsApp pictures of his cows so that he can monitor how they're progressing, and you know, just give some advice to his wife if they need to be fed more or whatever. Now, neither the husband or the wife can read or write, but they know how to send pictures to each other on WhatsApp. You know, you'll have come across examples of police stations that, you know, now regularly send out most wanted pictures of criminals through WhatsApp, and criminals have been caught because people have recognized the most wanted poster that they've received from the police on WhatsApp. You know, doctors in India are now WhatsApping each other pictures of x-rays and patients conditions to try and get quicker referrals, which is sort of, becoming a really transformative technology for healthcare in India. Now, it's a very simple technology, but it's being used in quite transformative ways, way beyond what, media are doing inside the platform. And generally speaking, and I think this is general criticism of pretty much every news organization, media organization, is that they are really much slower with adopting the full potential of any new technology compared to other sectors of the industry. And we spend a lot of time going to sort of media conferences where media organizations are talking to each other about what great innovation they're doing, when actually they never actually look up and see what the rest of the world is doing, which tends to be much more innovative. And it might be, something that is worth looking at, even from a, sort of student perspective, about what are the other really innovative, disruptive things happening outside the media industry and technology, and how can we bring that element of disruption into our own industry, because then that might actually accelerate what would be really useful for you.
Thanks so much, Trushar. Thanks, Jen.
Thanks. Yeah, great point. Journalists tend to see it as, how can we use this to do what we do? That's a really good point. So people were writing things down. You should write that point down.
Jane, Trushar, thank you very much indeed for being with us. It's been very educative, and I hope we all enjoyed it. And we learned quite a lot from the conversation we had with each other and with us, with the Q&A. So thank you very much indeed for being with us. And
okay.
Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
Thanks for the good questions.
Jane, I'll circulate your presentation with the amongst the students. I have them with me.
Okay, great. That's great. So should I hang up here?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Thanks to you all. Enjoy your weekend.